Well, hello there. I thought I would put on my winter hat since it is winter after all. So we're going to be going into chapter 18, and Mrs. Hyatt had told the kids to stop the not talking, but they didn't really listen to her. So now we're going to into 5th grade lunch to see how she handles their not talking. Adventures in the Red Zone. Now, I know you football fans out there are thinking, oh, red zone, that's where you score a touchdown, right? The 20 yards before a touchdown. It's like an exciting place to be. But a red zone can also be sort of an angry place to be. So let's see how this ties in. Mrs. Hyatt got back to her school at 11:59. There were several messages on her desk, and Mrs. Overby had taped a note on her chair that read, "Please come see me in the teacher's room." But the principal was in a hurry. She needed to be on time for the 5th grade lunch. 5 minutes later, for the second day in a row, Mrs. Hyatt found herself standing in the middle of a silent cafeteria holding a red plastic bullhorn. But today, it was different. She looked around the quiet room, and the sight of all these 5th graders deliberately disobeying her, well, it nudged her over the edge. It pushed her right into the red zone. She gritted her teeth, and an angry haze filled her mind, and she knew she was angry, and she knew it wasn't good to be angry, but she was. And she knew it wasn't good to be angry and try to talk to children at the same time. But she couldn't help herself. She had to talk to these kids right now. She could have whispered, and every 5th grader would have heard her, but she didn't whisper. She pulled the trigger on her bullhorn. "Have you forgotten the assembly this morning?" The principal's voice echoed off the walls. The kids stared at her. She aimed the bullhorn at Dave and yelled, "Dave Packer, answer me! Do you remember what I told you all this morning?" Then Dave nodded his head, and she yelled, "Answer me! With your voice! Out loud!" Dave swallowed his first bite of macaroni and cheese and said, "I remember." His voice sounded very small, and Dave felt like he was the Scarecrow talking to the great and powerful Wizard of Oz. Mrs. Hyatt took 5 steps closer to Dave and shouted, "Then why aren't you talking with your friends?" Dave had never seen Mrs. Hyatt this mad before, and no one had ever yelled at him with a bullhorn. It seemed unfair to be yelled at with that giant voice, so he decided he wasn't going to be afraid or angry, no matter what. Dave shrugged and said, "Nothing to say," which was perfectly true because before Mrs. Hyatt had started yelling, he'd been very happy to just sit and eat and think. "Stand up!" This isn't going well, is it? Dave stood up. Every kid in the room was watching him, and so was Mrs. Marlowe and the custodian and the cafeteria workers. And Mrs. Hyatt said, "Talk! I want to hear you talk right now. I want to hear you tell Todd everything you learned in all your classes this morning. Start talking to Todd right now." Dave wasn't an angry sort of kid, not usually. In fact, there was one thing that nudged him over the edge: being bullied. The only time he ever had gotten into a fight at school was back in 2nd grade when a 5th grader had started picking on him. That's when Dave had learned that you can't just go along with a bully because then you get bullied more and more. And that's how Dave felt right now. He was getting mad. It felt like Mrs. Hyatt was being a bully with a bullhorn. And there she is, yelling at him through that thing. And he's starting to get a little mad himself. Again, the principal yelled, "Talk!" And that did it. It was Dave's turn for a trip to the red zone. He glared at Mrs. Hyatt and he shouted, "I do not have to talk now if I don't want to. This is our lunchtime. None of us have to talk." And a sentence flashed in Dave's mind, something he'd heard dozens of times on TV shows. This sentence was usually being said to criminals wearing handcuffs, but that didn't seem to matter at the moment. Dave looked around the cafeteria at his classmates and he shouted, "You have the right to remain silent." And with that, Dave pressed his lips together, folded his arms across his chest, and sat down. Lindsay was the first one to pick up on Dave's body language. She looked at Mrs. Hyatt and slowly folded her arms. All the girls at her lunch table did the same, and the gesture spread through the room like ripples on a pond. Every kid stared at the principal, arms folded, stone silent. Mrs. Hyatt looked around slowly, drew herself up to full height, and then walked briskly out of the room. She walked down the hall to the school office. She nodded at Mrs. Chaplin, the school secretary, and said, "Hold my calls." Then she went into her own office and closed the door. Back in the cafeteria, it was dead calm. Every kid sat motionless, arms still folded, not sure what to do next. And then Todd started it. He unfolded his arms and nodded at Dave, and then he clapped his hands. In 3 seconds, every fifth-grade boy was clapping his hands. And a second later, guess who joined in? That's right, all the girls. And 5 seconds later, the hooting and the whooping began. It was loud in that cafeteria. It was incredibly loud. The clapping and the cheering was so loud that the sound went right through the cafeteria doors and walls and thundered down the hall, all the way to the school office, and right through the closed door of Mrs. Abigail Hyatt, principal. The phone on Mrs. Chaplin's desk buzzed. An intercom call. "Yes," she answered. The secretary listened, nodded, and said, "Right away." She got up and walked out of the office and down the hall and into the cafeteria, where it had gotten quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe was standing near the doorway, and Mrs. Chaplin whispered something to her. Mrs. Marlowe nodded and quickly walked halfway across the room. She bent down close to Dave Packer's ear and said, "To the office." Dave swallowed his third bite of macaroni and cheese and looked up into the science teacher's face. "I have to?" She nodded. "Principal's orders." Dave looked around the table at his friends. No one needed to speak a word at all. Their faces said it. And the message? 3 simple words, and Dave believed them. You are dead. Whew, what do you think of that? That was quite a scene. What do you think Mrs. Hyatt is going to say to Dave once he's in her office?